You're standing in front of the mirror, rehearsing what you'll say when you see them again. The words tumble out, carefully chosen, perfectly articulated. You anticipate their response, craft your rebuttal, imagine their face as you deliver that devastating final line. The conversation plays out flawlessly in your mind. Victory is yours before a single word is spoken aloud. But here's what you don't notice. This isn't the first time you've had this conversation. You've been having it for years. Different faces, different contexts, but always the same script. Always the same ending. The story you're telling yourself has become so familiar, so automatic, that you mistake it for truth itself. What if I told you that right now, in this very moment, you're living inside a narrative you didn't consciously choose? That the story running in the background of your mind, the one explaining who you are, why things happen to you, what you're capable of, is shaping every decision you make, every emotion you feel, every possibility you see or fail to see. You think you're observing reality. You believe your thoughts are responses to what's happening around you. But what if the opposite is true? What if the narrative came first and reality is simply conforming to match it? Consider this. Two people experience the exact same rejection. Same words, same circumstances, same outcome. One walks away thinking, I'm not good enough. I never have been. This always happens to me. The other thinks, that wasn't the right fit. Something better is waiting. Same event. Two completely different realities. Not because the facts changed, but because the story changed. Which one is true? Both. Neither. The question itself reveals the trap. You see, truth isn't what happened, truth is the meaning you assign to what happened. And that meaning, it was written long before this moment, probably before you were old enough to question whether the author even knew what they were doing. Every day you wake up and step into a story already in progress. The protagonist has been defined. The conflicts have been established. The themes were set in childhood, reinforced by trauma, validated by selective memory, and now they run on autopilot. You are not living your life, you are performing a script you inherited, adapted, and internalized so deeply that you've forgotten it's a script at all. But what happens when you start to see the edges of the narrative? When you catch yourself mid-sentence and realize you've said this before, felt this before, chosen this before. Not because it's inevitable, but because it's familiar. What happens when you discover that the prison you've been trying to escape has walls made entirely of words? Your words, spoken so many times they calcified into beliefs, and beliefs repeated so often they became your identity. The most terrifying part isn't that you've been living in a story. It's that you're still writing it. Right now. With every thought you think you're merely observing. With every interpretation you assume is objective. With every conclusion you reach that feels like discovery but is actually just confirmation of what you already decided was true. The question isn't whether your inner narrative shapes your reality. The question is, whose narrative is it? Really? And if you don't like the ending you're heading toward, do you even know how to write a different one? The narrative didn't start with you. It started with someone else's fear, someone else's limitation, someone else's unprocessed pain. And then it became yours. Carl Jung called it the inherited unconscious. But the mechanism is far more insidious than most people realize. Before you could speak, before you could reason, before you had any defense against it, you were absorbing stories. Not the kind told at bedtime, but the kind embedded in a parent's anxious glance, a teacher's dismissive tone, a culture's unspoken rules about who gets to want what. These weren't just influences. They were installations. Raw code written directly into your operating system before you even knew you had one. Jung understood that we don't just learn behaviors, we inherit entire mythologies. The hero who must prove their worth. The victim who never catches a break. The outsider who doesn't belong. These aren't personality traits. They're archetypal patterns, and you didn't choose yours. You woke up one day already cast in a role, already performing lines you didn't write, in a play you didn't audition for. But here's where it gets darker. Nietzsche saw what most people refuse to see. We don't just passively receive these narratives, we cling to them. Even the painful ones, especially the painful ones. Why would anyone choose to see themselves as fundamentally broken, chronically unlucky, or destined to fail? Because there's a perverse comfort in a coherent story, even a tragic one. The alternative, the possibility that life is random, that suffering is meaningless, that you have far more agency than you've been using, is absolutely terrifying. Nietzsche called it slave morality, the tendency to build an identity around powerlessness because it absolves you of responsibility. If you're the victim of circumstances, genetics, or fate, then you don't have to face the crushing weight of your own unused potential. Schopenhauer went even further. He argued that the human mind is fundamentally a storytelling machine designed not to reveal truth, but to protect the ego. We don't perceive reality and then interpret it, we have an interpretation, and then we search for a reality that matches. Your brain is not an objective recording device. It's a lawyer, and it's been hired by your narrative. Every memory you recall has been edited to support the case. Every perception is filtered through the lens of what you've already decided is true. You think you're remembering your childhood, but you're actually remembering the story you've told about your childhood. A story that's been revised, condensed, and shaped to fit the identity you're defending. This is why two siblings can grow up in the same house and remember completely different childhoods. They're not lying. They're living in different narratives, and each narrative has curated its own evidence. Viktor Frankl discovered this in the most horrific laboratory imaginable, the Nazi concentration camps. He watched as prisoners in identical circumstances had radically different psychological experiences, not because their suffering was different, but because the meaning they assigned to their suffering was different. Some found purpose. Some found despair. Same hell, different stories. And the story, Frankl realized, was everything. It determined who survived and who didn't, who retained their humanity and who lost it. But here's the part that should shake you to your core. Frankl also noticed that most people, even in freedom, are still imprisoned by narratives they never questioned. They live in mental cages built from interpretations they made in moments of pain, fear, or confusion, interpretations that became convictions, then identities, then destinies. Sartre called this bad faith. The act of pretending you have no choice when you actually do. We tell ourselves we can't change, that we're just this way, that our patterns are personality rather than programming. We mistake the familiar for the inevitable. The hidden problem isn't that you have an inner narrative. The problem is that you've forgotten it's just a narrative. You've confused the map for the territory, the story for the truth, the interpretation for the fact. And because you can't see the narrative, you can't edit it. You're trapped in a loop, experiencing the same conflicts, attracting the same situations, making the same mistakes. Not because the universe is conspiring against you, but because you keep showing up with the same script, expecting a different play. The narrative has become invisible, automatic, synonymous with just how things are. And that invisibility, that's exactly what gives it power. The narrative doesn't just influence your thoughts, it engineers your entire experienced reality with surgical precision. Neuroscientists have discovered something unsettling. Your brain processes approximately 11 million bits of information per second, but your conscious mind can only handle about 40 bits. That means you're perceiving roughly 0.0004% of available reality at any given moment. The rest? Filtered out, deleted, ignored. But here's the crucial question: what determines which 40 bits make it through? Your narrative does. It's called the reticular activating system, and it's essentially a bouncer at the nightclub of your consciousness. It decides what gets in based on what you've told it matters. And what have you told it matters? Whatever supports the story you're already telling. If your narrative says, people can't be trusted, your RAS will scan 11 million bits of data per second and surface the micro-expression of doubt, the slight hesitation in someone's voice, the ambiguous text message. It will ignore the 10,000 bits of evidence suggesting trustworthiness and hand-deliver the 5 bits that confirm your suspicion. You didn't consciously choose to look for betrayal. Your narrative did it for you. And then you experience the discovery of untrustworthiness as objective observation rather than selective attention. This is confirmation bias weaponized at a neurological level. You're not seeing reality and then interpreting it. You're living inside an interpretation and then finding a reality that matches. Consider the person convinced they're bad at relationships. This isn't just low self-esteem, it's a prediction model. Their brain, committed to narrative coherence, will unconsciously guide them toward partners who confirm the story. They'll overlook green flags and obsess over red ones. They'll misinterpret neutral behavior as rejection. They'll sabotage connection the moment it threatens to contradict their identity. And when the relationship fails, they don't think, "I created this outcome." They think, "See? I told you, I'm just bad at this." The narrative wins again. Reality bends to accommodate it. But the consequences go deeper than individual relationships or career choices. Your narrative literally shapes your physiology. Research in psychoneuroimmunology has shown that chronic narratives of helplessness suppress immune function. The story, "I'm powerless," doesn't just make you feel bad. It makes you sick. Your body receives the interpretation as instruction and produces stress hormones accordingly. Cortisol floods your system not because you're in danger, but because your narrative says you are. Meanwhile, someone experiencing the exact same stressor but interpreting it as a challenge I can handle has a completely different physiological response. Lower cortisol, increased problem-solving capacity, better cardiovascular function. Same circumstance, different story, different body. Your narrative is quite literally writing itself into your cells. And society? Society is a collective hallucination built from millions of individual narratives stacked on top of each other, all pretending to be objective reality. Cultural narratives determine who gets believed in court, who gets hired, who gets second chances, and who gets written off as hopeless. These aren't facts. They're stories we've agreed to treat as facts. Stories about gender, race, class, potential, and worth. Stories so embedded in our institutions that we mistake them for natural law. You inherit these collective narratives alongside your personal ones. They tell you what success means, what happiness requires, what safety demands. And because everyone around you is performing the same script, you never think to question whether the script itself is valid. The person working 80-hour weeks, destroying their health to climb a ladder they never asked if they wanted to climb, isn't making individual choices. They're performing a cultural narrative about worth and productivity. The narrative says, your value is your output, and they believe it so completely that burnout feels like personal failure rather than narrative conclusion. The most insidious consequence is this: the narrative becomes self-reinforcing to the point of being unfalsifiable. Any evidence against your story gets reinterpreted to support it. If you believe nothing ever works out for me, and something good happens, your narrative explains it away as a fluke, an anomaly, or a setup for future disappointment. The story survives by metabolizing contradictions. You're not living in reality anymore. You're living in a closed loop, a self-contained system where every experience, good or bad, gets converted into proof that your narrative is true. And the most terrifying part? You have no idea you're doing it. The way out begins with a single, devastating act of recognition. You have to catch yourself mid-story. Not after the fact, when you're analyzing what went wrong. Not during reflection, when you're safely removed from the moment. But right there, in real time, as the narrative is happening, you have to see it for what it is. This is harder than it sounds. Your narrative has had decades to perfect its invisibility. It presents itself as perception, as common sense, as just noticing what's obviously true. The moment you think you're simply observing reality, you've already lost. The narrative is speaking, and you're mistaking its voice for your own. But there are cracks, moments when the script glitches. Pay attention to the stories you tell repeatedly. The ones that start with "I always" or "people never" or "things like this happened to me." These aren't observations, they're incantations. You're not describing patterns. You're creating them through repetition. Listen to the language you use when something goes wrong. Do you immediately jump to interpretation? Of course this happened. I knew it would. That's not wisdom, that's a narrative protecting itself by claiming it predicted what it actually orchestrated. The rebellion starts when you interrupt that automatic interpretation and ask a question so simple it sounds absurd. Is that true? Or is that just the story? A woman I know spent 15 years believing she was not a creative person. She had evidence. She'd tried art classes as a child and felt embarrassed. She'd attempted writing and it felt forced. Every creative endeavor ended in self-conscious failure. One day, almost accidentally, she asked herself, what if I'm not uncreative? What if I just decided I was uncreative when I was 8 years old? And I've been performing that identity ever since. The question broke something open. She realized she'd never actually tried to create anything without the narrative running in the background, prejudging every attempt, comparing her beginner's work to master's, ensuring failure before she even began. So she made a rule. Create something, anything, without telling herself the story about what it means. No interpretación. No identity. Just action. Divorced from narrative. 6 months later, she'd written a novel. Not because she suddenly became creative, but because she stopped performing the story of someone who wasn't. This is the first weapon against the narrative, radical present tense awareness. The practice of catching the story before it calcifies into identity. But awareness alone isn't enough. You need to actively author a counter-narrative, and this is where most people fail. They try to replace a negative story with a positive one. I'm not worthless, I'm valuable. And wonder why it doesn't stick. It doesn't work because you're still operating within the same framework. You're still defining yourself through a narrative, just swapping adjectives. The cage is still a cage, even if you paint it gold. True rebellion requires something more radical. Narrative flexibility. The ability to hold multiple stories simultaneously without collapsing into any single one. You are not one story. You are the space in which stories occur. The ancient Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But the power isn't in controlling the narrative. It's in recognizing that you are not identical to it. When something bad happens, practice holding competing interpretations without choosing one. This could mean I'm unlucky. Could mean I'm being redirected towards something better. It could mean nothing at all, just random circumstance. Don't collapse into certainty. Live in the productive tension of multiple possibilities. This feels unstable at first. Your brain craves narrative closure, a definitive answer to, what does this mean? But that craving is exactly what keeps you trapped. Meaning is not discovered, it's assigned. And you can assign it differently. The most powerful rebellion is this. Start writing your story forward instead of backward. Stop mining your past for evidence of who you are. Stop letting old wounds dictate future possibilities. Instead, ask, who would I need to become to create the life I actually want? Then tell that story so consistently, so deliberately, that your brain starts finding evidence for it instead. Your narrative will resist. It will call this inauthentic, delusional, fake. That's how you know it's working. You're not lying. You're authoring. And you've always been authoring, you just didn't know you had a choice about what you wrote. Here is the truth that changes everything. The one insight that makes all your previous struggles suddenly legible. You were never discovering who you are. You were always deciding. Every moment you thought you were uncovering some essential truth about yourself, your limitations, your patterns, your nature, you were actually making a choice. A choice so automatic, so habitual, so invisible that it felt like fate. But it was never fate. It was authorship in disguise. The ultimate illusion isn't that your narrative shapes reality. The ultimate illusion is that there's a you separate from the narrative in the first place. You think you have a story, but you are the story. A story that's been telling itself for so long it forgot it was fiction and started believing it was biography. And here's where it gets truly profound. If you are the story, then changing the story doesn't just change your experience of reality. It changes the fundamental nature of who you are. This is what the mystics understood and what modern psychology is only beginning to grasp. There is no fixed self beneath the narrative waiting to be discovered. There is only the ongoing act of self-creation, moment by moment, story by story, choice by choice. The Buddha called it anatta, the doctrine of no self. Not because you don't exist, but because what you call you is a constantly shifting pattern of stories, none of which are more true than any other. You are not finding yourself. You are composing yourself in real time, always. This should be liberating, but for most people it's terrifying. Because if there's no essential you to discover, then you're responsible for everything. Every excuse evaporates. Every limitation you've been hiding behind reveals itself as a choice you've been making. I can't change becomes, I haven't changed. That's just who I am becomes, that's who I've been practicing being. Life is hard for people like me becomes, I've been telling a story in which life is hard, and then living accordingly. The weight of that responsibility is crushing, until you realize it's also the source of your freedom. You are not trapped in a story someone else wrote. You are trapped in a story you've been unconsciously writing and then pretending you're just reading. And the moment you see this, truly see it, the entire game changes. Every morning you wake up with a blank page. Not actually blank, of course, there are consequences from previous chapters, characters you've developed, plot lines you've set in motion. But the narrative is still live, still being written, still yours to shape. The person who hurt you last year, that's a historical fact. The story about what it means about you, about people, about trust, about your future, that's optional. You keep rewriting that story every time you reference it, every time you use it as evidence, every time you let it inform a current decision. What if you just stopped? What if you let that event exist as a fact without letting it become a truth? What if you refuse to extract a universal principle from a singular experience? This is the ultimate act of rebellion, living without the compulsive need to make everything mean something about you. Most people spend their entire lives building an identity out of interpretations, then defending that identity as if their survival depends on it. They collect wounds like credentials, patterns like personality traits, limitations like inheritances they have no choice but to accept. But you do have a choice, not about what happened, that's history, but about what it means, about what you make it mean, about whether you let it define what's possible going forward. The ultimate truth is this: reality isn't happening to you. You're happening to reality. Your narrative isn't a passive reflection of what is, it's an active force shaping what will be. And once you see this, once you really understand that you are both the author and the story, the narrator and the protagonist, the interpreter and the interpreted, everything becomes possible again. Not in some vague, inspirational way, but in the most practical, immediate sense. You can literally decide who you're going to be next. Not by forcing change or fighting your nature, but by recognizing you never had a fixed nature to begin with. You've been writing fiction and calling it autobiography. And the moment you see that, you can write anything. The only question left is, what story do you want to tell next?